Detective Martin Reyes had seen a lot during his 20 years with the police. He'd investigated countless murders, robberies, and assaults. But the one thing that kept him up at night, the case that gnawed at his soul like a festering wound, was the 911 call from Pinehurst Street. It was a quiet evening in late October, just after dusk. The autumn chill had settled over the small town of Broad Hollow, and the streets were mostly empty. Reyes had been at the precinct, finishing up paperwork when the call came through. The dispatcher, Cindy, flagged it for him immediately. "Martin, this one's weird. A woman called in, but there's something off. You need to check it out." Weird calls weren't unusual. Drunkards, pranksters, or people mistaking animals for intruders. But Cindy's tone had a gravity to it that made him uneasy. He glanced at the address, 57 Pinehurst Street. His heart sank a little. That house had been abandoned for decades, ever since the unsolved murder of the Hemsworth family. No one had lived there since. Reyes grabbed his coat and headed out. As he drove, the radio played the recording of the call over his cruiser's speakers. 911, what's your emergency? At first, only static came through. Then, the voice of a woman, soft and trembling. "There's someone in my house. Please help me." "Ma'am, what's your address?" 57 Pinehurst Street. "Hurry, he's coming." Reyes felt a chill crawl up his spine. He increased his speed. "Ma'am, who is coming? Are you in immediate danger?" A pause, then the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer to the phone. "He's here," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's smiling." Reyes gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Ma'am, stay on the line. Officers are on their way. Can you describe him?" No, please, I don't... No." The line went dead. When Reyes arrived at the house, he wasn't prepared for what he saw. The Hemsworth residence had been untouched for years, its once grand structure now rotting and overgrown with weeds. The windows were boarded up and the front door hung crookedly on its hinges. He parked his cruiser, got out, and called for backup, but something told him he wouldn't have time to wait. The air was unnaturally still, like the world was holding its breath. He made his way to the front door, flashlight in one hand, gun in the other. He pushed the door open and was greeted by the overwhelming stench of decay. The inside of the house was dark, save for the faint glow of his flashlight beam illuminating dust-covered furniture and peeling wallpaper. "Broad Hollow PD," Reyes called out, his voice echoing through the empty halls. "Is anyone here?" Nothing but silence. He moved deeper into the house, checking room by room. In the living room, a faded portrait of the Hemsworth family still hung above the fireplace. Parents, 2 children, all smiling. Their eyes seemed to follow him as he passed. Reyes's radio crackled to life. "Martin, you there?" It was Cindy. "Yeah, I'm here. No sign of anyone yet, but the house is a wreck. I'm going to keep looking." "Be careful. That call was off. We tried tracing it, but it didn't come from any phone line." "What do you mean?" "I mean there's no record of the call coming from that address. It was like it came from nowhere." Reyes's pulse quickened. He stepped into the kitchen. The floor was littered with debris, and the once white tiles were stained a sickly brown. That's when he noticed something strange. The dust on the floor had been disturbed. Footprints, bare, small, like those of a child, led from the doorway to the basement stairs. His gut told him to leave, but something stronger, a force he couldn't quite explain, drew him toward the basement. He descended the creaking stairs slowly, the air growing colder with each step. The smell of rot intensified. At the bottom of the stairs, his flashlight beam landed on something that made his blood run cold. In the center of the basement floor was a circle, crudely drawn in what looked like blood. Inside the circle lay several objects: a broken doll, a rusted locket, and a crumpled photo of the Hemsworth family. Suddenly, a sound behind him, soft like a child's laughter. Reyes spun around, his flashlight darting across the room. In the far corner, something moved. A figure, small and hunched, barely visible in the darkness. It stepped forward, revealing a little girl, her hair matted and face gaunt. She was dressed in a tattered white nightgown, her eyes wide and empty. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally in the confined space. "He's still here." Reyes raised his gun. "Who's here?" "Who did this?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed behind him, toward the circle. Reyes hesitated, then turned. The basement seemed to shift. The walls pulsed as if the house itself were alive. And in the center of the circle, standing now where there had been nothing just moments ago, was a man. His face was twisted into a grotesque grin, his eyes wide with unnatural glee. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his clothes were old-fashioned, as though from another era. Reyes backed up, his heart pounding in his chest. The man's grin widened and he stepped forward. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Reyes fired. The shots rang out, deafening in the small space, but the man didn't flinch. Instead, he laughed, a high-pitched, manic sound that sent ice through Reyes's veins. The little girl screamed, and the lights went out. For a moment, there was only darkness and that horrible, echoing laughter. Reyes fumbled with his flashlight, trying to regain his bearings, but when the beam flickered back on, the man was gone. So was the girl. The basement was empty, save for the circle and the objects inside it. His radio crackled again. "Martin, what's going on? We're sending units to your location. Hang tight." Reyes could barely speak. His throat felt tight, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. He stumbled back up the stairs, his hands shaking. He needed to get out of that house, away from whatever malevolent force was still lurking within its walls. As he reached the front door, something caught his eye, a photo lying face down on the floor. He picked it up, turning it over. It was the Hemsworth family again, but this time, something was different. The father's face had changed, twisted into the same grotesque grin as the man in the basement. And the little girl? She was gone from the photo entirely. Reyes fled the house, gasping for air as he collapsed on the front lawn. The backup officers arrived minutes later, but when they searched the house, they found nothing. No man, no girl, no circle in the basement. To this day, Detective Martin Reyes doesn't talk about what he saw in that house. The case was filed as unsolved, the call dismissed as a prank or a glitch in the system. But deep down, Reyes knew the truth. Something was still there, waiting, and it was smiling. In the days that followed the incident at 57 Pinehurst Street, Detective Martin Reyes couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him home. Every night, after returning from the precinct, he would catch fleeting glimpses of shadows out of the corner of his eye and faint whispers that seemed to drift just beyond his reach. At first, he chalked it up to stress. His mind was playing tricks on him, he thought. The events in that house had unsettled him more than he cared to admit, but it would pass. However, as the days turned into weeks, the strange occurrences only grew worse. One evening, while sitting in his kitchen with a stiff drink, he heard it again, a soft, high-pitched giggle, like a child playing. It was faint, barely audible but unmistakable. His heart rate spiked, and he set his glass down, his eyes scanning the empty room. Nothing, but the air had changed, grown colder, as if someone, or something was there, watching him. Reyes stood up and checked every room in the house, his paranoia growing with each passing moment. The house was empty. The windows were locked. There was no one else inside. But that feeling, that oppressive presence, lingered. That night, as he lay in bed, Reyes heard the creaking of footsteps just outside his door. His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, the door swung open. His hand instinctively reached for his gun on the nightstand, but his fingers trembled. The hallway was dark, but there was someone, standing there, just beyond the threshold. A small silhouette, no taller than a child. "Help me," the voice whispered. The same voice from the basement. It was the little girl. Reyes shot up in bed, his chest heaving with panic. The figure was gone, the hallway empty. He rubbed his eyes, telling himself it had been a nightmare, but deep down he knew it wasn't. Over the next few days, Reyes avoided going home as much as he could. He threw himself into work, hoping it would drown out the creeping dread that had taken root in his mind. But the more he tried to escape it, the worse it got. The whispers followed him everywhere, at the precinct, while driving, even in broad daylight. Sometimes it was the girl's voice, sometimes it was the man's laughter. It was relentless, like an infection spreading through his thoughts. Then, one night, Reyes made a terrible decision. He decided to go back to the Hemsworth house. He didn't tell anyone, not Cindy, not his fellow officers, not even his captain. He wasn't sure what he hoped to find, but something inside him, whether it was curiosity or madness, drove him back to that cursed place. It was late, around midnight, when he parked his cruiser outside the house. The wind howled through the empty streets, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the lawn. The house loomed before him, a dark, rotting shell of its former self. Reyes hesitated for a moment, his hand resting on the door handle. He could still turn back. He could pretend none of this had ever happened and move on with his life. But he knew, deep down, that he couldn't. Not until he got answers. He stepped out of the car, his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness as he approached the house. The front door creaked open easily, as if it had been waiting for him. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and rot. Dust swirled in the beam of his flashlight, and the floorboards groaned beneath his weight. He retraced his steps from that night, moving through the living room, past the faded family portrait, and into the kitchen. The house seemed different this time. The silence was oppressive, the shadows deeper, more menacing. And then, just as before, he saw the footprints. Small, bare prints leading toward the basement stairs. Reyes swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't want to go back down there, but he knew he had no choice. As he descended the stairs, a soft clicking noise echoed from the walls, like the tapping of fingernails on wood. The basement was even colder than he remembered, and his breath formed clouds in the frigid air. His flashlight flickered for a moment, and that's when he saw it. The circle on the floor. It had returned, as if it had never been erased. The same objects were inside, the broken doll, the rusted locket, and the crumpled photo. But this time, there was something else. A figure stood in the center of the circle, a woman, her back to him. Her long, dark hair hung in tangled strands, and her white dress was stained with dirt and blood. "Ma'am?" Reyes called out, though he already knew she wasn't human. The woman turned slowly, and Reyes's blood ran cold. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow and black. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, her lips cracked and bleeding, and then, without a word, she pointed toward the far wall. Reyes followed her gesture, and that's when he saw it. The wall wasn't solid anymore. It seemed to pulse like flesh, and in its center was a dark opening, a doorway that hadn't been there before. He could hear it now, the faint sound of children laughing echoing from deep within the walls. He wanted to run, to leave, and never look back, but something was pulling him toward that doorway. It was like a current, dragging him deeper into the abyss. With trembling hands, Reyes stepped toward the opening. The walls around him seemed to close in, the air thick with the scent of decay. His flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into complete darkness. He was inside now, inside the walls of the house. The laughter grew louder, more frantic, and then he saw them, shadows darting in and out of his vision, small figures running and playing, their giggles twisted and wrong. And then he heard it again, that same voice, the little girl's voice. "He's here. He's always been here." Reyes's heart pounded in his chest as a figure emerged from the darkness. The man from the basement, with his grotesque grin and wide, unblinking eyes. His body moved in sharp, unnatural jerks like a puppet on strings. "Welcome home," the man said, his voice a guttural rasp. Reyes tried to run, but his feet wouldn't move. He was trapped, paralyzed by the man's gaze. The shadows closed in around him, their laughter turning into shrill, ear-piercing screams, and then everything went black. When the backup units finally arrived at 57 Pinehurst Street hours later, they found Reyes's cruiser parked outside. The house, however, was empty. There was no sign of him, no trace that he had ever been there. The case was closed soon after, Reyes declared missing in action. But those who knew him, those who had heard the stories, whispered about the house on Pinehurst Street and the things that lived inside its walls. And late at night, if you listened closely, you could still hear the faint sound of children laughing, calling for help. But no one ever answered.